Even the so-called constructive programs were actually lethal, like take the Alliance for Progress. You know, most of a lot of what happened in Central America is just because we imposed dictators and gangsters and terrorists and so on if they ever try to get independent, as in Guatemala. But every once in a while there's something called a constructive program. The Alliance for Progress is the famous case. Well, you know, the Alliance for Progress was like a plague, probably the worst plague that hit Central America until the Reagan administration. That's killers in a category by themselves. The Alliance for Progress, first of all, was a completely cynical operation. I mean, the Alliance for Progress was not instituted by the Kennedy administration because they suddenly discovered that there are poor people in Central America. And they knew that all along. It was initiated because they were afraid that the poor people in Central America were going to follow the Cuban model. Now that means it began as a purely cynical operation, okay, and that showed. The Alliance for Progress was designed to impose on Latin America altogether, in fact, an agro-export model. They're supposed to shift production from subsistence crops to export for the benefit of U.S. agribusiness and the American market. Well, that has consequences. For example, it means that farmers in Central America are expected not to produce rice and beans for them, people locally to eat, but asparagus and broccoli and flowers for yuppie markets in the United States. Well, for one thing, it means they're not going to have anything to eat, so they got to import food, which they import from us at high costs, which is good for American agriculture. Subsidized usually by the American taxpayer, now subsidized by them. And it also means that, and that food is not going to be equally distributed. It's going to be distributed to the rich. Furthermore, the production is going to be by the rich because it takes capital inputs to produce the fancy fruits for the American market. So there's going to be landless peasants. Furthermore, they're going to produce beef. In fact, every Central American country, beef production moved up rapidly under the Alliance for Progress, while beef consumption reduced. And the reason is that ranchers moved in, often with North American connections, drove peasants off their land, turned it into grazing lands so they could send beef to North American markets for hamburgers. Great for terrific for American agribusiness and for pesticide and fertilizer manufacturers and for the rich in Central America, but not very good for the people. Now, you take a look at, go to your favorite economics book or Latin American studies book, and they'll tell you that the Alliance for Progress created an economic miracle. Well, you know, from a certain point of view, it did. Gross national product went up all through Central America. So did malnutrition. You know. And the reason is obvious. You drive people off the land up into the hills, and you take over their land, and you produce beef for export and fancy crops. It's good for the gross national product. Just means the people starve. You know. In fact, the crisis of the 1980s is largely caused by that plague. Well, let's just take the 1980s. During the 1980s, the Reagan administration is responsible for roughly 200,000 people slaughtered. And that doesn't mean just killed. You know, that means tortured and mutilated and raped. I mean, Pol Pot-style torture. That's pretty serious business. Hundreds of thousands, in fact millions of refugees, large areas of the country destroyed. All of this in an effort to block social reform in all three major countries where we were involved, in Honduras and El Salvador and Nicaragua. Now that's serious. What should we do? Well, the first thing we should do is stop torturing them. The second thing we should do is pay reparations, because we owe them. After that, maybe there's some hope that they could reconstruct from the damage we've done to them. I think that's what we ought to do. Try to find anybody suggesting that in the mainstream, however. You can't express this view, not because it's false, but because it's true. And if you look into it, you'll find that it's true, I think. Now, what should we do? I mean, let's go back. Well, what we should do, I mean, we are free to act. Plenty of things that we can do. And for one thing, we can just provide aid ourselves. You don't have to wait for the state to order you to provide aid. They need it badly. I mean, Nicaragua is reeling. The hurricane last October was the final blow. They're going to have mass starvation there. Now, the government, of course, is delighted. The U.S. government, they won't send them a penny because they want them to suffer as much as possible. But American citizens are much more independent. And in fact, they've raised a lot of money. For example, there's one small Jesuit center in North Carolina or Virginia or somewhere, the Quest for Peace, it's called, the Quixote Center. I think they may have 3 staff members or something. They've raised millions of dollars from people in the United States who are able to think for themselves, who aren't just slaves of power. And those are things that can be done. You can help people survive. And you can, after all, put pressure on Congress, on the media, to do something about this. A lot of ways of doing that. All sorts of ways, ranging from civil disobedience to writing letters to the editor to, a mass popular organization. They're not going to put you in jail for it. In that sense, it's a very free country, which means if you don't do it, you have a lot more responsibility than if you don't do it in a place where you are afraid that you're going to be repressed. So there's no shortage of things to do. It's just a matter of willingness to do them. And the willingness to do them begins with a willingness to recognize reality. That's the hardest part. I think once you recognize reality, you won't have any more questions about what to do, because it's too obvious. So the first thing to do is to recognize the reality. And that takes a little work. But once you recognize it, I think it's obvious what to do.
When I graduate, I'm going to be a history teacher?
History teacher.
What do you suggest in the high school? Or what do you suggest I do in that context to keep from perpetuating?
Well, that's really important. I mean, a lot of people, I suspect many of you, if you think of your own experience, I know me, you can remember cases where a teacher really made a terrific impression on you. I mean, most schooling is just training for stupidity and conformity. But every once in a while, and that's institutional too, there are reasons for that. But occasionally, you get a spark. Somebody will challenge your mind, make you think, encourage you to think, and so on. And that's a tremendous effect. You just reach all sorts of people. Of course, if you do it, you're going to be, you may very well have problems. You have to tread a narrow line. There are plenty of people who don't want students to think. They're afraid of the crisis of democracy. People start thinking and you get all these problems I was quoting at the beginning. They won't have humility enough to submit to a civil rule, or they'll start trying to press their demands in the political arena, or they'll, have ideas of their own instead of believing what they're told. And privilege and power typically doesn't want that, so they can react. And a high school teacher who tries to get students to think may find repression, firing, and so on.
You said a lot about the role of the media in a so-called democracy. I'm wondering how you see the role of our educational system, what it's doing right now, what forces are driving it, and what constraints are on it, and how should it operate?
Mm-hmm. Well, I quoted the Trilateral Commission view of the educational system, namely it's a system of indoctrination of the young. And I think that's correct. It's a system of indoctrination of the young. That was the way the liberal elites regard it, and they're more or less accurate. So the educational system is supposed to train people to be obedient, conformist, not think too much, do what you're told, stay passive, don't cause any crises of democracy, don't raise any questions, and so on. That's basically what the system is about. Even the fact that the system has a lot of stupidity in it, I think, has a function. It means that people are filtered out for obedience. If you can guarantee lots of stupidity in the educational system, like stupid assignments and things like that, that the only people who will make it through are people like me and like most of you, I guess, who are willing to do it no matter how stupid it is, because we want to go to the next step, So you may know that this assignment is idiotic and the guy up there couldn't think his way out of a paper bag, but you'll do it anyway because that's the way you get to the next class. And you want to make it, and so on and so forth. Well, there are people who don't do that, there are people who say, I'm not going to do it, it's too ridiculous, Those people are called behavioral problems, or something like that. They end up in the principal's office, or in the streets, or selling drugs, or whatever. And all of this is a technique for selection for obedience. And I don't know how to prove this, but I have a feeling that when you go to the elite universities, you find more obedience and conformity. Probably because you're getting the students who were better able to do it. Well, all of that is functional. That's the way it works. But it works right through graduate school. I mean, by the time you get to graduate school, it's already a little more varied because some real contradictions develop in the system. The problem is that you can't have progress this way. Now, especially in the sciences and engineering, that's a problem because the corporations need science and engineering. If If you don't have innovation, you're really in trouble. So they have to encourage creativity and independence, because you can't get anywhere if you just copy what somebody told you. You have to be challenging things all the time, challenging everything, and thinking new thoughts and so on. And there you got a real contradiction. It's hard to train people to be creative and challenging and so on, and yet to ensure that somewhere else in their lives they're conformist and obedient and never think. So you have problems. That's a serious problem in Japan, incidentally. We think of Japan as this tremendous superpower, but that's very misleading. Japan, for example, is very poor in science, for example, and they're aware of it. And part of the reason is it's part of the same thing that makes them good workers, obedient workers. It's a very obedient society, very deferential and conformist society. And one effect of that is that there are real constraints against independent, free thinking, and you see it in the sciences very clearly. But it's a problem here too. So there are those contradictions, and when you get to graduate school, they're beginning to show up. They show up much less in the ideological subjects, because there it doesn't matter so much if people have, profits aren't made by historians having original ideas about the French Revolution, so they can have conventional ideas. And that means that the pressure to try to support innovation and freedom is much less, and the pressures for conformity, on the other hand, are much greater, because in the ideological subjects it begins to be dangerous if people think the wrong thoughts. It's not so dangerous if they have new ideas about physics. But nevertheless, you begin to get a little flux in the system by the time you get to graduate school. And even at lower levels, you find it. I mean, there are teachers who do stimulate thought, and sometimes they get away with it. And all the way through, if people are learning things, you just can't control. You can't make them just regurgitate what they heard. Now, there's a lot of pressure to turn the schools into the Marine Corps, and there's a lot of support for it. For example, there's this bestseller last couple of years by Alan Bloom. That was all over the supermarkets, Closing of the American Mind, huge bestseller, supermarket racks, which is where I read it, and things like that. Well, you take a look at what he's saying, and there was plenty, a lot of enthusiastic accolades for it and so on. He was saying that a couple of us smart guys will decide what the great thoughts are, and every student will memorize them, and that's education. Okay. Well, that's a way to turn people into pure automata. I mean, even if they happen to pick the great thoughts, there is no way less likely to get anybody to think about those thoughts than to make that the curriculum. That finishes them off, and I think that's the purpose, really. I mean, the purpose is just to impose authority, Here's the great thoughts. All this other stuff is rubbish. Just learn those and you're okay. I'll pick them, you memorize them. That's basically the line. Now, of course, that's the opposite of education. I mean, that's the way you study Talmud or something like that. But it's very popular, and I think it reflects the same concern over the crisis of democracy. In fact, Bloom himself was extremely... The incident that really got to him was a case in Cornell, where he was a professor, where some black students took over one of the buildings. And he said that's just like the Nazis, it's back to the Nazis. He has a whole business about the Nazis and so on and so forth. Well, you take a look at what happened in that. He doesn't tell you what he thought and he says the faculty capitulated, just like Heidegger capitulated to the Nazis and so on. What actually happened, if you look back, is that there were real grievances. Undoubtedly, the students shouldn't have done what they did and go into the building with guns and so on, but it was settled very amicably. It was settled amicably. Nobody was killed. The grievances were to some extent dealt with, and the net result was better than it was before. Well, he didn't tell you what he thought they should have done, but it's sort of implicit. I mean, I guess they should have bombed the place or something like that. But that's what really set him off. And in general, what set many people off was the 60s are now described in the literature as if it was a time when students were running around burning libraries and destroying the foundations of civilization and so on. What was actually going on is they were asking questions. They were raising questions. They were looking into things that people hadn't looked into before. They were not just obedient. And from the point of view of a lot of the faculty, that's equivalent to burning the buildings. You can't make that small distinction. You can't make that. There's pressure to turn the schools back to the days when you didn't have to worry about those things, like disobedient students asking questions about things that you didn't tell them to think about and so on.